generations to come.
Welcome to another edition of the TDN Writers Room Podcast. My name is Bill Finley. I'm a correspondent for the TDN and also co-host along with Dave Johnson, the Down the Stretch radio show on SiriusXM.
How y'all doing? I'm Randy Moss with NBC Sports and the Buyer Speed Figure Associates.
TD Thornton speaking to you from a little bit north of Boston today. I'm a stablemate of Bill's at Thoroughbred Daily News.
Very good. Well, guys, a lot to talk about. This was the last weekend on the road to the Kentucky Derby. Actually, I shouldn't say weekend because of course, the Bluegrass spilled over to Tuesday because of the bad weather. So why don't we start with the Santa Anita Derby? And we have a very firm now, I think, Kentucky Derby favorite in journalism. Not only did he win, he beat a good field. He got a good buyer number of 102. He overcame some traffic to win the race. He did decline from a 108 buyer to a 102, but I don't think, Randy, that's anything to worry about. Am I right about that? Is he the definitive solid favorite for the Kentucky Derby?
One of the more solid favorites that we've seen in quite some time. I mean, you go back to Justify, and as good as he looked in California, I don't think he was necessarily regarded as solid a favorite maybe as journalism is because of his lack of experience at the time when he came to the Kentucky Derby. Maybe American Pharoah in 2015, but I think you're looking at probably 2-1 on journalism. And nowadays in a 20-horse field in the Kentucky Derby, a 2-1 favorite, I think qualifies as being very solid.
He's impressive both from how fast he's won his races and the how he did it metric. He earned a 108 buyer speed figure going a mile and a 16th, 102 going 9 furlongs. Proven stalker, doesn't mind being pinned down inside on the rail and then tipping out to make his move. Almost didn't get a chance to do that in last Saturday's Santa Anita Derby. Umberto Rispoli had him down on the fence about 3/8 out, had to shoulder aside Barnes to get out for running room. It really was for a big athletic muscular horse like journalism. That was a complete momentum stop. He had to get going again, and he was able to run down Citizen Bull. The 2-year-old champ had already been put away by the up-and-coming Baeza, but journalism took dead aim on Baeza in the lane, blew past him, galloped out extremely well, came back spattered with dirt kickback. So, he was in there taking the brunt of the heavy going when he was pinned down inside. I guess really the only question left is, again, I'm not going to quibble with him being the favorite. He deserves to be the favorite. Once we see the post draw, we can argue over the next 3 weeks or so whether he's a bettable favorite. I guess my only questions are, did that effort take a lot out of him? And he really has been racing in fields that are on the lighter side. He's raced in, I believe, 3 5-horse fields in his career. Little different than a 20-horse field in the Derby, but you never know until they get out there and actually do it.
And at least we saw him overcome the traffic Saturday, like you pointed out. You mentioned that Umberto had to shoulder his way out. You watched the head-on replays. There were some elbows being exchanged between Juan Hernandez on Barnes and Rispoli on journalism. One of the things, Bill, that I think is really is going to contribute to journalism being such a solid Kentucky Derby favorite, aside from the obvious, and we'll talk some more about this later, it is looking increasingly after the Bluegrass Stakes like we're going to have a pace meltdown scenario in the Kentucky Derby. We're going to have a very fast pace in the Derby, and that's going to help a horse like journalism. He can be further back. He can be a little bit closer. He's got a little bit of tactical speed. He's got some versatility there, which I think is going to stand him in pretty good stead, assuming, to TD's point, that a 20-horse field doesn't mentally impact him in some way.
Anybody have any theories on what happened to the Baffert horses? I mean, my goodness, what price could you got on the dead last and next to last exact of Citizen Bull and Barnes? I mean, they were both looking so good, especially Citizen Bull coming into the race. And like I said, in a 5-horse field, they were 4th and 5th. I don't know I haven't read what Baffert's plans are for them going forward, but rare setback for Baffert in a Kentucky Derby prep race, especially one run at Santa Anita.
But very predictable. Barnes, by the way, is off the Derby trail. Citizen Bull, the intent is to run him in the Kentucky Derby. Bob feels like he was a little bit light on his training for Citizen Bull going into the Santa Anita Derby. But Barnes was not training well going into the Santa Anita Derby. They had blinkers on, blinkers off. You know, they were trying to find something there. They weigh the horses before the Santa Anita Derby. Okay, he lost a little bit more than 20 pounds from his previous race to the Santa Anita Derby, and growing 3-year-olds are supposed to be going in the opposite direction. So right there is enough to tell you that, you know, and he was going to be taken off the pace in the Santa Anita Derby, as opposed to his, you know, golden trip the time before when he made a nice, easy, comfortable early lead in the San Felipe. As far as Citizen Bull, we talked at length about how he had gotten away with beautiful, uncontested, orchestrated, front-running trips in his 3 previous races. Yes, he looked good, but, you know, easy leads. Now, the question was he going to get an easy lead in the Santa Anita Derby? You know, I talked to John Sheriffs the day before the race, and we talked primarily when the topic was Westwood about the fact that Westwood was entered to make the race a 5-horse field and to give Baeza potentially more points than he would have been able to get if it were a 4-horse field. Okay, that's why they ran the maiden to begin with. Then I hung up the phone and I looked at the past performances of Westwood. This horse has speed. You do pace figures. He's got more speed than Citizen Bull's been showing. So I got on the phone. I called Sheriffs back again, and I said, I forgot to ask you a very important question. If you're running Westwood to help Baeza get points, would you not use Westwood's speed to help Baeza in terms of hooking Citizen Bull on the front end? And he just kind of laughed, and he said, that's exactly what the battle plan is. Because that's probably better for Westwood anyway, and it also helps Baeza.
You know, I was kind of surprised that Bob Baffert opted for only one prep race prior to the Santa Anita Derby as a 3-year-old for the 2-year-old champ, Citizen Bull, particularly because I remember reporting back as early as, I think it was January, that Baffert had said, Citizen Bull is a big, heavy horse who thrives on racing. Well, he only gave him one race, and that was the February 1st Robert B. Lewis Stakes. He wired the field that day, and then he didn't race him in March in the San Felipe. Baffert has won the Santa Anita Derby on 9 previous occasions. I went back through the charts, and on none of those 9 occasions did he win it with a horse who didn't race in the month of March. And in fact, over the past 30 years since Baffert first won the Santa Anita Derby with Cavanier, he's had a horse in the race, and sometimes in some years, multiple horses in the Santa Anita Derby, pretty much every year for 3 decades. On only 6 previous occasions did he race a horse who had raced as far back, his last race, as February, and in a couple of cases farther back than that. So he didn't do that with the 2-year-old champ. And after the race, I know Daily Racing Form had quoted Bob as saying, geez, I wish I had another race in him. Well, he had his opportunity, didn't do it. I wouldn't totally pull the plug on Citizen Bull. I think that not only did Westwood go out and play the role of a rabbit, but Martin Garcia, the way he reacted to that was Citizen Bull broke running, and then he conceded the lead to the 40-1 long shot. But then about 6 furlongs out, instead of allowing Citizen Bull to settle, he said, no, I want to be outside and I want to go after the pace again. So I don't think Citizen Bull ever had a chance to get into a proper rhythm. I think he was a quote unquote short horse for the race. And although he was able to put away Westwood by the far turn, and he was able to resist the initial bid of Baeza, he had nothing left at the quarter pole. And Martin Garcia didn't beat up on him when it was evident he wasn't going to get a higher placing. So not a great effort, not the good mojo going to Louisville, but I wouldn't give up on Citizen Bull just yet based off of that one race.
So we've been talking.
This is my Citizen Bull plug right here, by the way. I pulled it as soon as he crossed the finish line.
Okay. So now we've talked a lot about Baeza, who was second. And first of all, the horse with the pedigree makes him very sexy, the half-brother to Mage and Dornoch. He ran his eyeballs out. He ran a great race. He belongs in the Kentucky Derby. Nobody can tell you that he's not one of the 20 best horses in the United States right now, or including the Japanese or UAE horses that want to come. I imagine even he would be about 20-1 or so in the Kentucky Derby instead of these guys that are 50-1. So Churchill changed the point system this year to give fewer points in races with 5 horses or less, 5 horses or fewer. So this really affected Baeza. He only got 37.5 points for running second in the Santa Anita Derby, where he would have gotten 50 if they didn't make this rule change. The 50 will get him in. Now he's 24th on the list as we speak. There's usually enough defections, and maybe Barnes is one of them right now. Maybe that moves him up to 23rd. He'll probably get in. But I don't like the way Churchill changed the system. I think it's kind of punitive towards California racing. I think that's what it was aimed at because they have so many small fields. Maybe, just maybe, one last knock on Bob Baffert. Oh, you're going to run your horses in all these 5-horse fields. Well, we're going to make you pay for it.
I have a different take on that. I don't think it was intended to be punitive, in my opinion, against Southern California or against Bob Baffert. I think on the surface, it makes sense. If you have a 5-horse field, it's obviously much easier to finish 4th or 5th than it is if you're in a 12-horse field, right? And so equal points or equal stature for both, I think, is a little bit unfair to the horses running in big fields. Now, could they do it a little differently? I agree with you there. As a matter of fact, I think that what they should do is not reduce the total number of points available. I think they should just reduce the number of placings that get points. So, for example, in the Santa Anita Derby, you could still have 100 to the winner, 50 to second, but maybe you only pay back the top 3 or maybe even the top 2 in a short field like that. But leave the top line horses intact and comparable to the other major, 100-point prep races. That's the way I view it. And by the way, I think Baeza is the second best horse in the Kentucky Derby if he runs, and I think he's going to be more like 6-1 or 7-1 than as high as 20-1. My opinion.
Yeah, I think Randy's onto a valid point there. Again, just backing up, let's consider that no qualification system is perfect, whether it's for horse racing to get into the Kentucky Derby, whether it's for NCAA basketball. You're always going to see somebody who's kind of left out of the bubble, and the system doesn't appear perfect, and it's not perfect. I think Randy's point has some validity. I've heard that mentioned before, payout to first and second. I guess in the back of my mind, at first blush, I would wonder if that would erode the fields even further. Maybe do you get in a situation in a subsequent year where somebody says, well, I'm not even going to get points for third. Why do I run in a small horse race? Maybe you flip that on its head, and the opposite is keeping the point structures the same for everybody, except incentivize horses that win in big fields. Maybe give them extra points if you win a 12-horse field or finish in the top points earning places in a larger field. I don't have a good answer, just throwing something out there.
Yeah, I mean, I see both your points. I especially see Randy's point. But Randy, I mean, think about this. You just said you think if he's in the race, he's the second best horse.
Yeah.
A system that doesn't allow the second best horse, in your opinion, to be in the Derby, it's not right. They screwed up.
I agree.
It shouldn't have happened that way.
In this situation,
I don't know what the perfect answer is either. I think both of you have good suggestions, but the horse belongs in the Derby. Let's hope that he makes it in. Like I said, I think he probably will.
I think Churchill would agree with that. I think Churchill wants a situation where potentially the second best horse in the race is in the race. And so I think they'll probably look at maybe some tweaks. The only other alternative would be partially to employ the Breeders' Cup model. Okay. And I know Churchill Downs Incorporated has never really been too keen on this, but you've already got a couple of horses from the Mideast European Road to the Derby spots. You've got one spot for the Japan Road to the Kentucky Derby. Okay. They could potentially hold out 2 spots, let's say, for a panel, for a panel to, a blue ribbon panel to pick out a couple of horses that don't make it into what would be left. Top 15 in points and add a couple more. And in a case like that, maybe they could rectify a situation in which a horse like Baez is excluded.
And I think for this year, though, one thing that you're not going to see is, my understanding is that John Sheriff's, even though they will draw 20 for the Derby and they will maintain a field of 4 also eligibles, and we saw a couple of years ago, that's how Rich Strike drew into the race and won the 22 Derby as a big long shot. I think John is already on record, though, as saying he doesn't want to ship the horse to Louisville and wait it out to see if he gets on the also eligible list, and then wait it out to see if he draws in. So if he doesn't draw into the main body of 20, I think you're going to see Baeza maybe in Baltimore.
And to draw in post position number 20 if he draws in, which is not a good scenario either.
Obviously not. Well, we want to remind you that the TDN Writers Room is brought to you by Keeneland. It was a big weekend of winning for Keeneland sales grads who kicked off the celebration with a trifecta in the Grade 1 or Group 1 Dubai Golden Shaheen. Dark Saffron, Nakatomi, and Tuz cost a combined $50,000. That's remarkable. Took home over $1.7 million in this race alone. Then Tenma went on to win the Santa Anita Oaks, and Rodriguez won the Wood Memorial. They'll both be heading to Louisville for Oaks and Derby weekend.
Leslie's Rose, Sierra, Leon.
Mike, $5 million. Thank you.
Carl Spackler, a Mercy. She feels pretty. Hup!
Now we go to our fastest horse of the week, presented by the Fast Sires at Windstar Farm, including Cogburn, who was billed as the fastest horse in the world, and for good reason. In the Longines World Horse Racing Rankings, Cogburn was rated at 120 pounds, making him number 1 among sprinters. And remember that 2024 Jaipur Stakes at Saratoga, in which Cogburn ran the fastest 5.5 furlongs ever, 59.80, which was good also. For a 114 buyer speed figure, the fastest buyer of that year. Cogburn has a full book in 2025 at Windstar, and Widden Stud in Australia just set Cogburn's Southern Hemisphere fee at $27,500 Australian. Now, this week we have 2 fastest horses of the week. Journalism, who we just said had a 102 buyer. Matching that at Santa Anita from a Friday allowance race, a horse named Wound Up, who continued a remarkable win streak with a 7.5 length win in that allowance sprint. Wound Up was claimed last December at Pleasanton for $10,000 by trainer Librado Barosio. He won that day with a 78 buyer. Since then, his buyers have been 92, then 97, then 99, and last Friday, 102. He won all those races with an average win margin of 6 lengths. He's now won 5 straight, 8 of his last 11, and Wound Up. And Journalism, our co-fastest horses of the week.
Welcome in now the Gainesway Guest of the Week. It is Emma Berry, who's the European and International editor for the Thoroughbred Daily News. Emma, usually we have you on to talk about nice things. Who's going to run in the Arc de Triomphe? What's coming up in the Epsom Derby? First of all, how are you? And secondly, you know where we're going with this. We're going to talk about tariffs.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for asking. I'm very well. Looking forward to the classic trials getting underway here in Europe. They've actually already underway in Europe, but getting underway in Britain this weekend. But yes, tariffs are rather looming over all the news at the moment here. We're obviously waiting to see what sort of retaliation measures, if any, come into play from the UK and the European Union after the announcement last week from the White House.
So, I mean, right now the stuff is very complicated and there's more questions than there are answers. But the gist of it is, and the reason why we wanted to have you on as a European expert, is that my understanding, and maybe it could change tomorrow or the day after, but if an American goes over to a European sale, buys a horse and brings it back to race in the United States, they will be subject to a tariff. I believe right now it's 20% for EU countries and 10% for Great Britain. What is the mood over there? How is this going to affect the European sales?
Yeah, that's what we're all asking. And as you say, no one knows any of the answers yet. And It's going to very much depend in the next few weeks to see the level of retaliation. I know that, Britain in particular, which is where obviously I'm living, Sir Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, is very cautious in this regard. And I know his government is hoping to strike a trade deal with America, but I'm sure there are umpteen countries trying to do that. So I don't think we'll see any sort of knee-jerk, we haven't already seen any sort of knee-jerk reaction here. And certainly, business leaders in Britain are urging the Prime Minister not to retaliate with tariffs of our own. So it's hard to see how it's going to play out the other way. But certainly, as you say, at the moment, for Americans buying in Europe, which happens an awful lot, both at public auction and in private sales, those tariffs will apparently be applied to horses by their own suffix. So even if you're buying in Britain, you could be buying a Tattersall's, but buying an Irish-bred horse or a French-bred horse. And as we understand it at the moment, certainly as the shipping companies understand it, you would be subject to the tariffs imposed by suffix, if that makes sense. So 20% on Irish and French and German horses, 10% on British-bred horses. That's going to have surely an impact on the level of spending. There are obviously an awful lot of American owners and breeders who leave horses in Europe permanently, either to race or to be bred from. So that won't affect them. But obviously a lot of, we certainly see at book one of the Tassels October Yearling Sale and book two, the likes of Mike Ryan come over and bring a lot of horses back for the turf program in America, to race with Chad Brown, etc. So one would have to think at this stage, if getting into the yearling sales later in the autumn or in the fall rather, that American spending would be reduced if we're in this situation then, which it seems that we're going to be. And, more immediately, the breeze-up sales have just started today, actually, in France. Next week's the big sale, the Tassels Craven breeze-up sale. Not so much of an American participation usually at that, but a little bit more at Arcana in May. So I think we're going to see quite soon how we're going to be affected. And one can only think at the moment that's going to be a reduction in spending by American owners.
And what are you hearing? What are the sales companies saying? For example, like what will be the first test where we see this in effect?
Yeah, at the moment, they're all pretty much saying we're going to just have to wait and see. And that's really all they can do. I mean, obviously, there must be a level of concern in-house. And I'm sure they'll be thinking about ways which they can, make this easier for American buyers still to come. I'm sure we're not going to suddenly see no Americans turning up in Europe, but things will shift. But equally, if we lose some American buyers in this part of the world, it may be that it opens up opportunities for buyers from other parts of the world to think, well, perhaps I won't be spending so much. If you're a Japanese owner, maybe you wouldn't be spending so much at Keeneland with the tariffs imposed on Japan. Perhaps you might increase the spending in Europe. I mean, that you're buying different types of horses at different places, of course. So lots of factors will have to be taken into consideration. But I think it'll be more a kind of a shift of buyers rather than suddenly a huge drop off.
So I'll be honest with you. I've tried to keep up with this stuff and looked at it and tried to. I can't figure out what the hell's going on here. And I think I'm not alone. I mean, I don't think anybody even knows what the final verdict on all this stuff is going to be. So let me just ask you a couple of just really basic questions. In your opinion, if the tariffs are implemented as it appears they currently might be, is this a minor inconvenience? Is it a major inconvenience? Is it a catastrophic inconvenience?
I'd go somewhere between major and minor, not catastrophic. I think, we've all seen the industry come through COVID, continue to, we had massive lockdowns and complete cessation of racing for 6 or so weeks in Europe during COVID. And we managed to get everything back on track, get the breeze up sales back on track. Then this is a different situation, but I think people are very adaptive, quick to react and adapt to the situation. And I think we'll probably see, as I've said, a difference in buying patterns. But But we also had, in this part of the world, it's slightly different. But in the last few years, we've had to adapt to Brexit, which changed the movement, the free movement of horses under the tripartite agreement between Britain, Ireland, and France. That stopped all that, and we've suddenly had to pay extra to vets and customs to move horses in and out of the EU to Britain. That seemed to be not catastrophic, but it seemed to be a major drama at the time. It's caused a lot of inconvenience and extra paperwork and extra expense for people, but people have got their heads around it now, and that's what will happen as this situation evolves and we understand what we're looking at. Certainly, it's going to make things very uncertain for this year throughout the sales and racing season, I would think.
And correct me if I'm wrong, it's not just a European problem, it's potentially an American problem as well. You mentioned Chad Brown. I mean, right now in America, we are so accustomed to seeing almost all of our best turf horses being horses that were either purchased in Europe or began their racing careers in Europe. And then there's a whole industry of bloodstock agents looking in Europe for bargains to bring to America to race. I mean, that could be hugely impacted as well, correct?
I would imagine so, yes. And my own gut feeling at the moment, looking at it in the same way as you, not really knowing exactly how it's going to play out or what the longer term implications are. But my gut feeling is that ultimately I think this will hurt the American thoroughbred industry more than it hurts. It's countries that it does regular business with, obviously most of Europe, Japan, other areas. I worry more for what will go on internally in America than for us outside.
Emma, understand again, like Randy, I mean, this stuff makes my head spin and it's very hard to understand. So thank you for coming on and explaining. But and this is sort of piggybacking off what Randy said. And I know you said the EU countries and Great Britain have not yet announced, I believe, any retaliatory would that be the right word? Retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. But suppose they do, what would that mean if Aidan O'Brien comes over and wins 2 Breeders' Cup races? Does he have to pay a tariff for coming over and winning in America? Pay a tariff to Ireland?
I don't know what it will mean as regards prize money earnings. I wouldn't have thought so, but again, I'm just guessing now. But as regards bringing horses into the country to race, I'm sure that very much as we do now for either taking horses into the EU from Britain, either broodmares or race horses, you go in under a temporary import certificate and you pay a bond, and that's returned. Certainly, Coolmore, for example, were very quick to react to the Brexit situation, and they have a system which they call a carnet, which if you're taking a mare from here to visit a Coolmore stallion, they look after all the VAT for you. So, and the mare's in Ireland for several months, been covered and scanned in full, and then comes back and that's refunded. And they helped breeders by making that easier for them to do. I'm sure big organisations like Keeneland or Breeders' Cup, what have you, they'll have that situation all in hand by the time overseas horses will be coming into race. I know that you had looked at that in TDN for the Kentucky Derby, for example, but I would imagine we'll have that same situation ongoing. It's more for the sort of longer term or permanent, buying a horse to come and race in America and stay there type of situation, which you'll have to pay a tariff, I would think. So, for example, at the Arcana sale in a few weeks' time, a quarter of the catalogue are American breds that have been pinhooked at the September yearling sales, and they won't be part of that if they get bought by Americans to come back to the country, which does happen sometimes.
Emma, do you see a certain American, like for instance, Peter Brand is one of the leading buyers in Europe. Do you see him or some of the other people that buy over there potentially buying horses and just saying, you know what, we'll race them in Europe, enjoy, running them at Longchamp, running them at Newmarket, running them at Royal Ascot? Could that be one of the ramifications of this?
I think it could well be. I mean, that would be a bonus, obviously, for trainers here. I mean, there are already Peter Brandt, as you say, he He has a lot of horses in America, but also still a lot in Europe. Other owners like Craig Bernick, John Stewart has horses here now. There's a whole bunch of people that are already taking, advantage of that. Medallion Racing have Porta Fortuna with Donica O'Brien. There are lots of examples of that, and I think we perhaps might see it more. That again would potentially be a downside for American racing, which could boost trainers here and stud farms here as well.
Barry Irwin, Team Valor, they have a lot of horses over there as well. Yeah. Could see that.
Well, I'm less confused now than when we started this conversation. So you've done a good job explaining things. And for both the European and U.S. racing industries, let's hope that these things can get straightened out so that they're not so draconian and to cause major problems. But I think on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, we have reason to worry. And thanks again for all your insights.
No, it's a pleasure. We're definitely going to have to watch this space, that's for sure.
Our Guest of the Week segment brought to you by Gainesway, home of the French Classic and Breeders' Cup Mile winner Caracante, who has a horse on the Kentucky Derby Trail. That would be Flying Mohawk, co-owned by Jason Worth, who picked up 50 Derby points with his runner-up finish in the Jeff Ruby Stakes. Caracante also is the sire of Grade 1 winners Spinderella and She Feels Pretty. And Caracante stands at Gainesway for a fee of $15,000. Gainesway, power, passion, performance.
The sun shines bright on Caracante. His first crops of racing age are showing brilliance on the racetrack with a high percentage of stakes winners. His versatility is evidenced by winners on all surfaces across the globe.
Spinderella could not have been more impressive.
She feels more than pretty. She feels fantastic.
It is all She Feels Pretty. The sun shines bright on this value sire. Caracante standing at Gainesway.
An exciting finish to the Santa Anita Derby this year. I have Aaron Willman who's joining me and Michael McCarthy. First of all, this horse, he got the perfect setup, didn't he?
I don't know about that, Millie. He got stopped pretty good going to the 3/8 pole. We knew we'd have a target on our back today. He announced his presence in the San Felipe, drew down on the rail, 2 Bafferts, 2 Sheriffs. We knew that they were going to be riding us. They did. For him to overcome the adversity he did today just proves what a spectacular horse he is. A lot of good energy, and the horse is doing the talking for us.
Michael, you've won some really big races, the Preakness with Rombauer, of course, but you were raised here in Arcadia and have watched the Santa Anita Derby for so many years. How does it feel to win this race?
Yeah, pretty exciting. Obviously, huge day on the Santa Anita calendar, huge day on any calendar, any kind of a Derby. Obviously, the last prep before the Kentucky Derby. So to go ahead and be a part of something like this and be lucky enough to win, super special.
What was important to you knowing that the Kentucky Derby is 4 weeks from now to see in this race?
I saw a little bit of adversity today, which I thought was very, very good. As you saw around the far turn, it took him a little bit to kind of get his feet underneath him, but once Umberto was able to wheel him outside, he started getting through the gears and picking him up through the lane and leveled off nicely and looked like he finished up well and galloped out well.
Congratulations to you all. He's a beautiful individual.
Thanks, Millie. Appreciate it.
One more Santa Anita note, and an encouraging one. The Classic meet concluded on Sunday with total handle up 5%, attendance up, field size up 7%, bucking a national trend. And most importantly, the track boasted a remarkable safety rating. Get this, 99.9715%. Great news coming out of the great race place.
So let's turn our attention now to the other big races of the weekend, and we'll start with the Wood Memorial at Aqueduct. And if you didn't like journalism before the Wood, you certainly had to like them more after that. Rodriguez, who was third in the San Felipe, beaten 11 1/4 lengths by journalism, came back and won the Wood Memorial with Mike Smith aboard, got a good trip on the inside on the lead, and certainly ran a race worthy of getting into the Kentucky Derby. But I don't know how he compares to, of course, journalism and whatnot. But I think this goes to show the strength, even in the 5-horse fields, of how good the California horses are this year, particularly journalism. What do you think, TD?
It's not often that you see a trainer employing blinkers off to try and get a wire-to-wire win, but that was the case with Rodriguez in the Wood. He had worn blinkers when he wired his maiden field fairly impressively back in January, and he earned a triple-digit buyer that day. I believe it was a 100. But in subsequent races, in the Lewis and the San Felipe Stakes, he was between horses and not really looking all that comfortable in either of those races. So Bob Baffert took the blinkers off for the Wood Memorial, shipped Rodriguez out to Aqueduct, and the results were impressive. He was out there on the lead. I thought he set a decent pace. He came back with a 101 buyer speed figure. And I see a lot of similarities between Rodriguez and his sire, Authentic. Both were horses who were most comfortable when allowed to roll out to the front and do their own thing on the lead. In fact, Authentic was 5 for 5. He was undefeated, and 2 of those wins were the Kentucky Derby and the Breeders' Cup Classic in the pandemic-altered year of 2020 when he was able to get to the front end. He was just 1 for 3 in races where he did not lead during the early or middle stages of the race. And another similarity is that Authentic was kind of a late foal. He was a little mentally slower to develop. He was a May 5th foal. Rodriguez, he's a baby. He's a May 20th foal. If he makes it into the first 2 legs of the Triple Crown, he won't even turn officially 3 and hit his 3rd birth date until May 20th after the Preakness Stakes is run. But Authentic benefited from the Derby being run in September in that pandemic year. Rodriguez is not going to have that type of time cushion to deal with. But I thought his win was very impressive. Finished up in 148.15. That's the fastest 9 furlong race, Derby points awarding prep race going all the way back to 2022. Maybe a knock against him, and maybe Randy, you could speak to this, his speed was doing pretty well at Aqueduct on Saturday. They ran 13 races on the main track, 6 wire-to-wire winners, 4 speed winners right up on the engine, and just 1 stalker and 2 horses from coming off the pace. So maybe the track did help him, but I think that's going to be the way that Rodriguez rolls regardless of how the track is playing.
Oh, totally agree. I mean, Rodriguez is a horse that needs to have the early lead to run his best. That's how he got his 100 buyer speed figure when he broke his maiden. And what happened to him after then was the fact that he was in Southern California with all of Baffert's other horses. They were all running against each other. And he was compromised because of that. When he ran against Citizen Bull, they didn't want him out there dueling head and head for the lead with Citizen Bull. So they worked with Rodriguez on trying to settle him a little off the pace. I don't think they wanted to try to settle Citizen Bull off the pace. Plus, Rodriguez was drawn outside of Citizen Bull, so it made sense to try to settle him. He didn't handle it very well. Then they ran him against Barnes. He was drawn outside of Barnes. So the strategy there was to go to the lead with Barnes, which they did, and try to settle Rodriguez again. He didn't handle it very well. Now, finally, he escapes that. He's the only Baffert horse in the Wood Memorial. He draws the rail to boot. He finally got a chance to run again the way he likes to run. And yes, he was impressive, but now look what happens. Now he goes to the Kentucky Derby with Citizen Bull, right? With East Avenue. We'll talk about him in just a second. With the Japanese horse at Admired Daytona, who went wire to wire in the UAE Derby. And oh, by the way, ridden by Christophe Lemaire, who went 21-4 the first quarter mile in the Kentucky Derby with his last UAE Derby winner, Crown Pride. So Rodriguez is very unlikely, in my opinion, to get that same sort of pace scenario that he got in the Wood.
And of course, the Wood Memorial has had a terrible time producing winners of the Kentucky Derby. The last one to win it was Fusiachi Pegasus in 2000. The last horse to even run in the Wood Memorial to win the Kentucky Derby was Funnyside in 2003. So it's been a rough go for that race over the last couple of decades. I also thought there was a feel-good story here with Mike Smith. He's 59 years old. He is going to ride this horse in the Kentucky Derby. It's his 29th career mount will be his 29th career mount in the Kentucky Derby. But how about this, guys? He rode his first Kentucky Derby 41 years ago. GD, you weren't even born 41 years ago, were you? Aboard Pine Circle as a young 18-year-old, and now he's back. It is a 59-year-old, 41 years later, and that's why they call him Big Money Mike Smith. They put up the big money. He shows up.
You know what's remarkable about this, Bill? He's 59. He'd be the oldest Kentucky Derby winning jockey if he happens to pull it off. Shoemaker was 54 when he won with Ferdinand. I remember going to Santa Anita, and I hope this doesn't offend people because Bill Shoemaker was one of the greatest jockeys, if not the greatest of all time. But when Shoemaker was on his farewell tour, I think he was 58, almost 59 years old on his farewell tour. And I went to Santa Anita, and I was just watching a standard race in the middle of the day, had the old school binoculars, right? It's like a 10-horse field going down the back stretch. And I'm like, who is this jockey? It was one jockey that just absolutely stood out, looked like a 10-pound bug boy. And I looked at it, and I looked at my program. It was Bill Shoemaker. At the tail end of his career, he looked like a 58-year-old jockey riding in a race, right? He didn't take care of himself the way that Mike Smith has taken care of himself. You watch the stretch run of the Wood Memorial, you can't tell Mike Smith apart from a 25-year-old rider. It's remarkable how Mike has taken care of his body and still looks as great as he does on the back of a horse. It's historic.
So let's turn our attention now to the Bluegrass. Burnham Square, after a kind of lackluster performance in the Fountain of Youth, wins for his connections. And I had called this before the Redemption Derby. And East Avenue was another one. He was just awful in his last two starts. He ran a bang-up second. So what happened to turn these horses around? Of the big prep races of the weekend, it got the slowest buyer of the three of a 96. I wouldn't like Burnham Square necessarily as a pick in the Kentucky Derby, but I'm sure that they're very pleased to see him bounce back. And East Avenue, Randy, I guess another speed horse, but all things considered, if he got the right trip, he showed so much ability in the past, and finally it looks like he broke through and they figured out whatever the heck was wrong with him for Brendan Walsh. I would like his chances, but again, as you mentioned earlier, it might be hard for a front runner to win this race.
I don't think there was anything wrong with him. I think he's one-dimensional. I think he has to have the early lead to win, and you saw the way he was ridden leaving the starting gate of the Bluegrass. Oh my God. They sent the you-know-what out of him to get the early lead away from Owen Almighty. And at that point, I mean, it's like you're watching the race. You stick a fork in this horse. I mean, are you kidding me? Ride him that aggressively to get the early lead in that kind of a pace. And, kudos to East Avenue that he's good enough to still be in front at the 16th pole. But the fact that Burnham Square could only beat that horse in a photo at the wire after the way that horse was ridden early, I don't want Burnham Square. I don't want East Avenue. I don't want River Thames, who doesn't want to run 1 1/8 miles, in my opinion, much less 1 1/4 miles. I don't like any of the horses coming out of the Bluegrass Stakes. But what East Avenue is going to do, you saw the way he was ridden. He's got to be in front. He's going to be ridden that way in the Kentucky Derby as well. And he's going to contribute to what is likely to be an exceptionally fast pace in Louisville.
Yeah, I actually thought East Avenue of the three ran the better race.
Yeah.
However, like Randy, I when I had to make my TDN top 20, which is published in the Wednesday edition of Thoroughbred Daily News, I put East Avenue only as high as 7th. Burnham Square was 8th, and River Thames had him at 10th. So I don't think that's a particularly strong race. But East Avenue, he gets points in my book. Blinkers on, went out there, just ripped it on the front end, 22.95 for the opening quarter, 46.95 for the half. He was passed by Owen Almighty at the head of the lane, clawed back the lead, and still was only pipped at the wire by the horse coming from dead last, Burnham Square. The track at Keeneland very often plays towards speed, but on Tuesday they had 7 races on the main track. Only one horse went wire to wire. No horses were speed threats dueling for the lead. 2 stalkers, 4 off-the-pace horses won, so he was a little bit against the grain of the surface. That 96 buyer, I'm not surprised it came back the lower of the 3 prep races over the past week. The final time of 151.33 translates to the second slowest Bluegrass since Keeneland switched their main track from synthetic over to dirt in 2014. And they weren't exactly motoring home in the final furlong, 13.44 seconds. That is the slowest closing final eighth out of nine furlong races so far this year. And in fact, in any of the other races that we've seen in 24, 25 that award Derby points that are 9 furlongs, nobody else closed a final furlong higher than 13 seconds. So a little bit out of the norm there for East Avenue.
Another thing that I noticed out of this race worth pointing out is sometimes it pays to listen to your trainer. Brian Lynch said after the Tampa Bay Derby, "I don't want to run in the Kentucky Derby. This horse can't go 1.25 miles. Let's point for the Pat Day mile." The owners got Derby fever. They overruled him. And he, of all things, a dead heat. How often do you see this? A dead heat for last. Which with Chancer McPatrick. So the owners of Owen Almighty, next time maybe you ought to listen to your trainer. He's a pretty smart guy. He usually knows what he's talking about.
Sometimes you can get little nuggets of information that help you in your handicapping when you listen to these trainer quotes. Like East Avenue coming out of the Risen Star. He ran so terribly. Something had to be wrong with him, right? But then you listen to Brendan Walsh. No, the horse is fine. The horse came back just fine. So then what happened to him? There's only one explanation. He didn't make the early lead. So you know how he was going to be ridden in the Bluegrass, and that's exactly what happened. And the TDN Writers Room, as always, also brought to you by the Pennsylvania Horse Breeders Association, the PHBA. This week, we continue our Pennsylvania farm tour with the stallions of Pin Oak Lane Farm and a familiar name, Preakness winner, Cloud Computing, 2024's leading Pennsylvania sire by progeny earnings, as well as the number 2 stallion in the entire Mid-Atlantic region. The son of McLean's Music stands for $3,500. And Pin Oak Lane Farm is also home to Lord Shannakill by Sire of Sires, Speightstown. Lord Shannakill was a Group 1 winner of almost $1 million. He sired 17 stakes horses, including My Dream Boat, who beat Coolmore's Breeders' Cup Turf and ARC winner Found in the Group 1 Prince of Wales Stakes at Royal Ascot. Lord Shannakill stands for $2,500. To learn more about Pennsylvania options, you can take a look at the 2025 Stallion and Boarding Farm Directory online at pabred.com, or you can call 610-444-1050.
PA Bred, I think we've built a brand at this point.
It's excitement at every step.
Roses for Deborah just set a new track record.
On average, for the past decade, Pennsylvania paid over $28 million a year in Breeders' Awards, restricted races, and owner bonuses. Plus, PA Bred shine on the world's biggest stage. Just 3 states have bred more Breeders' Cup winners. Learn more at pabred.com.
Be a smarter better with First TV, the best horses, with thousands of exclusive morning workouts, all at your fingertips and delivered right into your inbox. Everything you need to be informed. Be smart, bet smart with First TV.
And I want to remind you the TDN Writers Room is brought to you by First TV. Nysos, remember him? He's nearing a return to the races. 4-year-old has had his sharpest work yet on Sunday, going 6 furlongs from the gate and 111.2 in company with Speedboat Beach. It was the fastest of 5 moves on the day. Nysos is unraced since his win in the Robert B. Lewis over a year ago and won his only 3 starts by over 26 lengths. Trainer Bob Baffert says he'll make his next start in the Grade 1 Churchill Downs Stakes on the Kentucky Derby undercard. Speedboat Beach won the 2023 Grade 1 Malibu in his last start in 2023, but will also target a race to be determined on the Derby undercard. Well, there was more news off the track, and T.D. Thornton was covering it for the Thoroughbred Daily News about the decoupling situation in Florida. And the gist of it is that it passed through a Senate committee after passing through Assembly committee. But I guess, well, maybe good news, maybe not good news. TD will tell us. They extended now the deadline, or not the deadline, but the time frame for the decoupling from 5 years to 7 years. TD, does that mean much? I mean, is this at least somewhat of a moral victory for the non-decoupling people?
I guess you do have to try and pick your moral victories where you can get them, but I don't think in the legislature it's sounding that good from my perspective. The hearing that Bill is referring to happened April 1st. So it was last week, but it occurred after we taped last week's podcast, so we didn't get a chance to talk about it. But the decoupling bill, which would mean that Gulfstream Park and Tampa Bay Downs no longer have to have a statutory live racing requirement tied to their gambling licenses. It's now passed 2 committees in the Florida House. It passed that first one on April 1st in the Senate. The thing that struck me in reporting on that hearing was that the way that the Senate, the busloads of supporters came in from Ocala. The racing and the breeding industries in Florida wanted to make a good showing at this Senate hearing, and they did. So many of them signed up to speak that their commentary was limited to about 90 seconds of speaking each, which seemed to rattle some people who had come prepared with big speeches, and they were asked to stand down before they made their main points. But what really struck me was after everybody had testified, but before the vote, the way the senators on that committee were talking. And they were talking as if it was already a foregone conclusion that it was going to pass their committee, but that they were going to throw a bone by having an amendment, which they did amend the Senate version of the bill, as Bill said, to extend the phase-in period from 5 years in the House bill to 7 years in the Senate bill. And the way they were talking, I'm not naive enough to think that legislators don't get together and talk about these things before the vote is a foregone conclusion. But they were pretty openly bandering this about before they took their vote about how they were sorry they had to do this. They really felt for the horse industry and that they promised there would be some dialogue in the future. Whether those turn out to be real promises or empty promises, I guess we'll find out. If you're skeptical about politics like me, I would think that they might kind of be empty promises. But the senators brought up a couple of points that they stuck to by their 5-2 vote. And one of them was that no other industry in the state of Florida, according to one of the senators on that committee, gets subsidized. It doesn't happen in Florida. Not the citrus industry, not their big dairy industry. It doesn't get subsidized. And although technically the slot revenue that horsemen receive for the purse accounts isn't a direct subsidy for the state, it's technically a pass-through from a private company, meaning Gulfstream Park in Tampa Bay Downs. It's still a subsidy, and some senators brought up the fact that basing your growth on subsidies is not sustainable. Whether you like it or not, that's a valid point. The other thing that they seem to be hitting on, some 30 people, maybe 35 people got up and testified against the bill. Only one person, Gulfstream's lobbyist, testified in favor of it. And he pointed out, and again, it's hard to argue against this, all other forms of gambling were decoupled in the state from their respective racing or high-ally licensure back in 2021. Why is thoroughbred racing the only one left? So they bring up some points that are going to be kind of tough to get around. I know some senators brought up that they wanted to enhance some dialogue to make this a win-win-win situation. Maybe the best hope for the racing and the breeding industry in Florida lies with Governor DeSantis, who one day after those hearings, last Wednesday, April 2nd, spoke at a press conference in Ocala. And he said all the right things because he was speaking in the heart of horse country in his state. But he said he was concerned about this legislation. Is his concern enough to be able to kill the bill? I don't know. That's the big question. But the clock is ticking. We're inside 4 weeks to when the Florida legislature ends. So we're going to probably see one more Senate committee hearing, and then it may or may not get up for a full vote and may or may not reach the governor's desk.
In my opinion, the only shot the Florida horse racing community has to get that bill defeated is a veto from DeSantis. I don't think there's a chance in hell that the Senate, that the legislature in Florida comes out against it when push comes to shove. And to be honest with you, we talked to Damon Thayer a couple of weeks ago, and you read all the quotes from the Florida horsemen's lobbyists and all that. And their mantra was, we understand that Belinda Stronach owns the property. We understand that it's worth $2 billion potentially, and that she's going to want to sell it, and we can't stop that. It's free enterprise. We get that. All we want is a little extra time to be able to get our ducks in a row and figure out where the horse racing industry goes from here. And that's exactly what they got in the compromise. 7 years. I mean, I don't know how much extra time they need, but I think, given the reality, barring a veto from DeSantis, I think that the horse industry should be, realistic and fairly pleased with the 7-year compromise, because to me, that's easily the best that they could hope for.
TD, there's two things on the table here. First one is the desire of the Stronach Group to build a casino on the property. The other one Randy just mentioned is the value of the property. One thing people haven't brought up, I don't think the casino there would be very successful. There's so many casinos in Florida as it is. And the Hard Rock Casino, which is iconic, we see commercials for it all the time on television, even down here in the Northeast. It's like a mile and a half away up the road in Hollywood. I don't know how they're going to compete against that. But so then maybe the real, and I can't read Belinda Stronach's mind, but maybe the thing that they really want to do is sell the property for the $1 to $2 billion. Is there any chance she says, I'm not waiting 7 years, forget about it, pulling the plug, goodbye everybody, and good luck with the rest of your life?
I think that's certainly within the realm of possibility. Yes.
The only mitigating part of that, Bill, is that if Belinda wants to sell the property, and obviously she does, it's not going to be like that. There are a lot of things that have to happen, business-wise, regulation-wise, and all that, before all that can be perfectly consummated. It may be 5 years, realistically, before that can even actually transpire. And there's some lawsuits involved, too, apparently, that have to be settled right now that are against First Racing. Before that can happen. So I don't think, a 7-year thing would be that much of a deal breaker, in my opinion.
All right. Well, TD Thornton's done an excellent job covering this for the TDN. And so keep watching and looking for his updates on the decoupling mess in Florida.
It's an exciting time for one of our sponsors here at the TDN Writers Room, West Point Thoroughbreds, which, of course, has Arkansas Derby winner Sandman prepping for the Kentucky Derby. Sandman is now settled in at Churchill Downs with trainer Mark Cassie, and Sandman is no doubt excited about all the early speed now lining up for the Derby. West Point will also be represented in Saturday's $400,000 Stone Street Lexington Stakes by Bullard, the promising graded stakes winning son of Gunrunner, making his first start since January. Remember, he was in the Rebel and had to be scratched because of a minor illness. Bullard is 2 for 3 lifetime. The Lexington will be his first start around 2 turns. And does this sound familiar? Bullard is trained by Michael McCarthy and will be ridden by Umberto Rispoli. And if he wins the Lexington, Bullard, can you say Preakness?
All the thrills. Fraction of the bills. Experience the power of the partnership. Change your life, make new friends, and compete at the highest level of thoroughbred racing. West Point Thoroughbreds, the gold standard in racing partnerships. Visit westpointtb.com.
Well, that's a wrap on this week's show. I want to thank TD Thornton and Randy Moss, my co-hosts and partners. Thank Emma Berry, the Gainesway Guest of the Week, as well as the people that work behind the scenes, the directors and producers, Sue Finley, Katie Petruniak, Anthony LaRocca, and Aaliyah LaRocca. Thanks for joining us this week. We'll see you next week.